In the 16th century, three empires of very similar nature came to dominate the Islamic world. These were called the Gunpowder Empires. These empires were the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Persian Empire, and the Mughal Empire in India. And this is a story about how nomads with faith and guns came to dominate the Islamic world. I say nomads because all of these three empires had their origins as nomadic Turkic groups that conquered settled peoples, with arguably far greater civilizations than the nomadic groups that were the forefathers of the Ottomans, Safavids, and the Moghals. Though this arguably fits greater patterns of history, as noted by the medieval Arabic historian Ibn Khaldun's ideas about asabiya, which is the idea of strong fringe tribal groups with a strong tribal unity and warlike nature, conquering decadent, weaker civilizations that due to their civilizational nature had become weak, could be invoked here as well. The origins of the Ottomans, the Safavids and the Mughals were in various regards very warlike, something which they kept even later after their initial conquests. And conquering many kingdoms and civilizations they did, but they also assimilated into those they conquered, adopting a lot of local ideas and customs. And in the case of the Safavids and Mughals, adopting Persian and Urdu, whereas the Ottomans kept their Turkic language, but also used Persian in court, and even Greek at times, and also called themselves a Roman Empire after the empire they had conquered. Not having much things connected to sedentary culture before these groups conquered these areas, they had to be flexible and adaptable in order to settle themselves in a functional way in these newly conquered lands. And the groups that would make up the three Gunpowder Empires not only assimilated quickly to a sedentary lifestyle and showed a willingness to adopt foreign concepts, but this adaptability also extended to being extremely quick in adopting new technology, especially the latest inventions in gunpowder weaponry, which brought them great power against their foes. And just like had happened in Europe with the introduction of gunpowder weapons, the introduction of gunpowder weapons into the Islamic world by these three gunpowder empires promoted changes towards centralized, absolutist, monarchical rule, as various states were able to monopolize the new artillery. Central authorities were able to unite larger territories into new or newly consolidated empires. Guns and a culture of a strong, warlike, previous nomadic culture, mixed with great adaptability, might have helped to conquer large territories, but their rise also had religious causes and effects, as the three empires brought with them new religious thinking into Islam. Sunni Hanafi Maturidism for both the Ottomans and the Mughals, and Shia Twelver Islam, both of which had been minority groups within Islam before, but now came to prominence as the dominant forms of Sunni and Shia Islam respectively. In fact, before, Ash'ari theology and Shafi'i jurisprudence had been the dominant forms of Sunni Islam, and Maturidism had been relegated to Central Asia, where the Turkic peoples came from, before they moved into the Middle East. And when it came to Shia Islam, it was various types of Zaydi and Ismaili Islam, and not Twelver Shia Islam that had been the dominant types of Shia Islam before. These types of Islam would now be imposed upon the conquered peoples, sometimes very successfully, like with the Safavids turning Iran from predominantly a Sunni Islamic region into their form of Shia Islam. The Safavids are, by Azerbaijan, Iran and Iraq, are predominantly Twelver Shia right now, to not so successfully with the Mughals struggling to convert various Hindu-dominated regions and non-Maturidi-believing Muslims to their version of Islam, to the in-between with the Ottomans managing to convert the Anatolian Peninsula from Christianity to their type of Islam, but having issues spreading the faith outside of it to various degrees. The religious imposition of these empires actually defined a lot of these groups and the relationship to the subjects under them and the empires, and created almost national-like identities with these religious impositions. For example, the Safavids from the beginning imposed a new religious identity on their general population. They did not seek to develop a national or linguistic identity, but their policy had that effect, according to Streisand. And similarly could be viewed with the Ottomans having a very distinct and different relationship to their version of Sunni Islam in relation to other non-Hanafi, non-Maturidi Muslims, sometimes leading to outright persecutions of other Sunnis, and the Mughals had an on and off again relationship of either becoming more concerned with other Muslim groups such as Shias or non-Hanafi, non-Maturidi Muslims than they had with the Hindus they had under them. But why was this imposition of a new theology so important, and why was it connected to a national-like identity and state, you might ask? Well, Sunni Maturidi theology, and especially the version of it developed by the Ottomans, gave a lot more power to the ruler to make laws and rule directly in various matters, in place of God. Likewise, the version of 12-hour Shia Islam that was promoted by the Safavids also preferred to confer direct rule to an earthly ruler acting in God's place as his representative on earth. This allowed centralized, national state-like politics. In comparison, previous Islamic theology had given much more legitimacy to local decentralized rulership and reduced power for a centralized ruler to directly legislate and rule, as the law was already set by the divine, and a ruler was more of an implementer of God's law rather than a creator of law in God's place. And this new theology created justification for a strongly centralized absolutist rulership that, together with a combination of a strong war culture, gunpowder and religious justification for absolutist rule, created a dominance of a few rulers in the Islamic world, not seen since the height of the Abbasids and the earlier Umayyads and Rashidun caliphs had the Islamic world been dominated under so few rulers that had almost all the powers. And these three empires were much more centralized than those previously mentioned entities had ever been, and the rulers had never been as absolutist due to the gunpowder, religious politics, and a doctrine of constant imposition of centralization upon the subjects that characterized the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals, and formed national-like identities in its wake. Now, this centralization had some great benefits, such as commercial expansion due to standardization and interconnection, facilitating trade, resulting in what Abhay Kumar Singh calls proto-industrialization in, for example, Mughal India. And in the Ottoman Empire, a man could travel from Albania in Europe to Mecca in the Middle East on the Arabic Peninsula and back within the same realm, and the same was true for trade and wares traveling within the Middle East. You also had a great patronage of culture, and legal institutions were consolidated with an increasing degree of centralization under a standardized law that was applicable to the entirety of the realms within each of these empires, that all developed standardized laws to govern their territories. Though it should be said that local systems of law still existed and were in constant conflict with the centralized law in many cases within these empires. But despite this, in a period of about 200 years, these empires flourished from the 16th to the 18th century and were among the greatest realms of the earth. It was in many regards a revival of the Islamic Golden Age of the Middle Ages, of the Abbasid Caliphate. Yet, not all was well, and there were a lot of conflicts with the areas that had been conquered, both large and small conflicts. These were everything from conflicts between law systems, which Sharia or law would be used in various cases of legal dispute, to questions about tax payment and self-government of local regions and local rulership that could turn into violent revolts and local conflicts. Centralization also failed a lot of times, and what was the results were often various half measures and bad compromises under weaker rulers that hurt both the greater empire and the local provinces, creating confusing mixes of legal systems and responsibilities, where there was a lot of ambiguity regarding who ruled and what was to be done in certain cases. And the religious politics of imposing one type of the Islamic religion in these empires led to a greater intolerance, especially later when they had already converted a large amount of the core people in the heartlands of the empires and had conquered a lot of peoples with different religious beliefs in the outer regions, creating an additional tension between the imperial center and outer regions in these empires. And the very missionary nature of these free empires led to religious rigidity that in certain regards translated into social rigidity and a lack of change later, when they had consolidated their power and no longer were as adaptable as they were in the beginning. Centralization together with the size of these empires meant that there was little oversight in the border regions. And thus, you could notice a rise of corruption and at times rather predatory tax farming from the centralized state side that occurred due to various private interests and corrupt bureaucrats sent from the centralized core abusing the outer regions of these empires, resulting in the stunting of the local development of these outer regions of the empires. Centralization and the imperial nature of these entities undermined, due to this corruption, often the local trust in the system and thus legitimacy of the centralized rulership, which was often used by local powerful families, such as the Mamluk families in Egypt, for example, to often rebel or to plan various types of subversion of the centralized authority whenever the centralized authority tried to do changes and reforms in various systems of the empire. Hence, imposing new changes and reforming and adapting to the times was disincentivized, especially as internal threats were often considered a bigger issue than other threats coming from the outside during the 16th and 17th centuries. Thus, there was not felt a great need for reform in these three empires. And lastly, absolutism, considered with the very strong centralization of the state in one person, meant that a bad ruler resulted usually in very bad results for the empire, which was often the case in the 18th century for these empires. Speaking about the 18th century and outer threats, some other entities that had mastered gunpowder had now come to take advantage. I'm talking about various European entities and other entities, such as the Maratha Confederacy. These would take advantage of this weakness that had occurred in these three gunpowder empires and further weaken these empires. And in the end of the 18th century, both the Safavids and the Mughals would collapse, leaving the Ottoman Empire as the only surviving gunpowder empire. An empire that would slowly decline over the coming centuries, and in the 20th century, after the First World War, collapse. And this is the story how nomads with faith and guns came to create three great centralized absolutist empires that came to dominate the Islamic world, but also through their own absolutist centralized structures caused their own downfalls, as social rigidity and corruption and bad rulership doomed them, showing both the benefits and the dangers in absolutist centralized rulership. Please do subscribe, as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities.
اشتركوا بالقناة من فضلكم.